Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Elizabeth Hamilton. I'm the executive editor here at the Connecticut Mirror, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our first annual update on the state of journalism in Connecticut. We're going to cover some of the progress that we've made as a nonprofit news organization and hopefully edify and entertain you with a behind-the-scenes look at who we are and how we have and how some of our stories have come together over the past year. Our publisher, Bruce Putterman, will start us off with a review of our growth as an organization. Bruce.
So I wanted to start with a brief review of our mission for everybody. You all are friends and fans of the Mirror. You probably kind of inherently understand what our mission is, but just to take you through that, our mission is to inform Connecticut residents about the impact of public policy on all residents of the state. It's to hold government accountable, and it's to amplify diverse voices and perspectives. And if we're successful at advancing our mission, then what we think we achieve is empowering communities and the residents of those communities, changing lives, and strengthening democracy. And you know, in terms of changing lives, people sometimes say to me, well, that's a pretty bold statement. How are you actually changing people's lives? But there's lots of examples, I think, in terms of how our reporting does change lives. So just Sunday, for example, we published a series, the first part of a 4-part series on the impact of eviction on children and mental health. And as part of that story, we published what's called a sidebar, which explained to people what they could do if they are served with a notice to quit, with an eviction notice. So that's one way in which we potentially change lives. We've written a lot about pandemic relief for essential workers. In fact, so many people responded to that story of ours, and we were the only news organization really to cover it, that the response crashed the state's website. So we kind of stand by the notion that our reporting can in fact change lives. So next slide. What I'd like to do is just kind of step back a few years and kind of give you a little summary of kind of where the journalism landscape was a few years ago and where we are today. So a few years ago, there were 18 daily newspapers in the state of Connecticut, and they covered what newspapers always traditionally covered. They covered breaking news. They covered the State House, you know, what was going on in the Capitol in Hartford. They covered Washington. There were Washington correspondents and reporters from Connecticut newspapers. They provided explanatory journalism that explained complex issues or provided context for those issues. They held government accountable for systems that aren't working through investigative journalism. They provided community news. They covered towns. And then, of course, there was sports, there was weather, there was food, there was arts, there was culture, and all of that. Today, essentially, as everybody I think knows, that those 18 daily newspapers have shrunk to one degree or another. Today, they cover breaking news, but there's limited coverage of state houses. There's limited explanatory or accountability or investigative journalism. In fact, they republish our content to fill the gaps in their own ability to publish explanatory and investigative journalism. And even many of them have limited community news. On the other hand, the Mirror has evolved over the last 13 years, and even, particularly over the last 3 years, and Beth will get to that in a few minutes, but we have evolved to largely be the State House press arm of the daily newspapers in Connecticut. And while a few news organizations still have their own State House reporters, we are, at least for them, they're a supplemental State House news bureau for those newspapers. We do publish journalism and stories that provides context for the complex issues that face the state. We do hold government accountable for systems that aren't working through our investigative journalism, and Andy and Jaden will talk about that in a few minutes. We do have a Washington reporter. We co-fund a Washington reporter with Connecticut Public. We do cover legislative proceedings throughout the legislative session, and you will see that in action the week we get back from the holidays. At some level, we are setting the agenda for what other news organizations cover, and at the very least, we frame the issues. We've had a number of senior government officials over the last however many years say to me, when we have a really complex story that we really want told in a way that we think will be accurate, we come to the Connecticut Mirror first. Connecticut Public does offer some coverage today that it falls somewhere in between the not too distant past and what I've characterized for today. And Hearst has made some recent investments in their digital only coverage that resembles our coverage, but for the most part, this chart kind of captures the situation today in terms of media. So rewinding again back to 2019, next slide, please. We had 8 journalists, and we had little old me, that's me on the right, doing business and revenue and operations. And then next slide, along came a brand new venture philanthropy organization called American Journalism Project. And we applied for a grant in their very first round of grant making. And their hypothesis was they could make grants to grow journalism by investing in the revenue side of news organizations. So, historically, grants for journalism went to reporters. It went directly to journalism. What made American Journalism Project different was they said we need to help ensure the sustainability of nonprofit news organizations. And so they invited 110 people or news organizations applied for one of those major grants. We were one of 11 news organizations to get a grant. And that kind of set us on the recent growth path that you're all aware of. Next slide. So this slide kind of reflects that. In 2017, our revenue was $792,000. Over the last 6 years, it's kind of crept up. And this year, we're expecting roughly $2.4 million in revenue, 3 times what our revenue was in 2017. And as a result, next slide, this is what our staff looks like today. Double the number of journalists. We'll have 16 journalists as of January 3rd when we have a new hire starting, new education reporter. And we have 4 people now on the business, revenue, and operations side, including me. Next slide, please. So switching gears, this is how we think of the relationship between audience and fiscal sustainability. At the top of this funnel, and by the way, for those of you who are not, marketing experts, this is a replica essentially of a traditional marketing funnel, how customers turn into repeat customers and that kind of thing. So for us, people come to our site. They read a story, they come back, they come to us through a variety of ways, through our newsletters, through search, through social, through friends sharing stories with them, etc. Some percentage of those people subscribe to our newsletter. Some percentage of those people become Connecticut Mirror members. And what that means basically is they make a donation. So that could say Connecticut Mirror donors as easily as it could say Connecticut Mirror members. Some of them turn into recurring donors. Many of you, no doubt, are recurring donors. People who have their credit card charged to deduct $10, $15, $25 a month for Connecticut Mirror. And then some percentage of those people or members in general become major donors, which we define as $1,000 or more. Next slide. So this slide kind of shows in one slide all of the different metrics by which we measure ourselves. So at some level, 2022 was a bit of a reset in that 2020 and to a lesser degree, but still 2021 were kind of the COVID years. And as I'm sure you all know, readership of news organizations of all stripes spiked considerably in 2020, started coming back down again in 2021. But even 2021 was still a strong year for many news organizations. And 2022 has been a little bit of a kind of return to equilibrium for all news organizations all around the country, from the biggest news organizations to the smallest news organizations. So we're doing some of our comparisons are to a pre-pandemic norm. So looking at the funnel on the right, our monthly website visitors is up 34% versus 2019, the last pre-pandemic year, average monthly visitors. Newsletter subscribers are up 10% versus 2021. And that's a key metric for us because we see a very, very clear relationship between number of people who subscribe to the newsletter to number of people who become donors and participate in the fiscal sustainability of the Mirror. Number of members, number of people making a donation at all to us is up 24% versus last year. The number of recurring donors, and those are the people who we know we can count on, and they help us with our planning, financial planning. That's up 30% versus 2021. And number of donors who give us $5,000 or more is up 26% versus last year. Now, reading back over on the left, a couple of other metrics you might find interesting. You may have noticed we publish fewer stories now than we did pre-pandemic. And the reason for that is because we are publishing more in-depth, longer form stories. And the good news is that while number of stories is down by design, number of page views per story, number of people coming to our story has doubled, up 101% versus 2019. So people are more engaged with our journalism, which is what we want to have happen. And at the same time, another way of looking at that is average reading time per story has increased 46%. So people are spending more time with each story. So not only, kind of more people coming to each story, but they're spending more time with each story. And that has translated into an increase in membership of 132%, more than double since the end of 2019. So, next slide, please. The other question I get a lot is, where does your revenue come from? Are you advertising driven, for example? The answer to that is a resounding no. About half of our revenue comes from major donors, people who give $1,000 or more, and we have about 70 people who fall into that camp, right? Or we will by the end of this year, in that range. Foundations are responsible for 30%. Actually, kind of doing this not in order, so let me make it simple for everybody. 30% of our revenue comes from foundations. This year, that's going to drop off because our American Journalism Project grant lapses at the end of December. It was a 3-year grant. So that number will come down a little bit. 48% of our revenue, almost half, is from major donors. Another 11% or so is from small donors, members, people who give under $1,000 a year. Only 5% of our revenue comes from advertising, which I think is surprising to a lot of people because it's just the model of news consumption that people are used to, that subscriptions and advertising is what pays reporters and for printing presses and whatever. For us, advertising is 5%. And the other 6% is content sales. You will see Mirror stories in the Hartford Courant, the New Haven Register, the New London Day. That's because those newspapers, 14 of them, in fact, are paying us a monthly licensing fee to be able to use our content. And then one final thing before I turn it back over to Beth, next slide, please, is that we have asked a question on 2 different surveys related to trust. Once in 2018, once in 2022. And the way the question goes is something like this. If the Connecticut Mirror were to cease to exist would you feel like you've lost a source of news that you can't find anywhere else, lost a source of news that you could find somewhere else, or it doesn't really matter if the Connecticut Mirror ceased to exist? So in 2018, 50% of people selected, I would feel like I lost a source of news that I can't find anywhere else. In 2022, that number was 73%. So the Connecticut Mirror is becoming increasingly a vital source of news for more and more people in the state. And from that, and from the fact that 14 newspapers republish our content daily, we view that as a deepening level of trust in the work that the Connecticut Mirror does. So we'll entertain questions at the end about anything that I just said, and then anything that Beth and Andy and Jaden talk about as well. And so we look forward to answering your questions in a few minutes.
Thanks, Bruce. So before we bring Andy and Jaden into the conversation, I'd like to kind of just quickly describe our news operation today, as opposed to what it was when I joined as editor. So the growth that has occurred on the business side of the organization, as Bruce pointed out, made possible a commensurate growth in editorial. When I joined the Mirror as editor in 2018, I led a newsroom that consisted of 7 full-time reporters, one of whom was in Washington, D.C., covering our congressional delegation. And I was the sole editor, and our office, such as it was in the press room of the state capitol, where we shared desk space, a very dirty microwave, and a water cooler with reporters from all over the state. Our staff meetings were generally held out in the hallway in whispered tones so that members of other news organizations couldn't hear us. So the staff was doing great work then. I mean, and I was thrilled to be a part of the organization, but the aspirations were limited by our size, which had remained largely stagnant since the Mirror was founded nearly a decade before that. Today, after 4.5 years in partnership with Bruce to grow the organization, I lead a diverse staff of 15 full-time journalists, not including myself, who come from around the country, who cover a wider range of topics, and who have allowed us to not only aspire to more ambitious work, but to actually execute it. It's really exciting. And since the beginning of the pandemic, we've created a 3-person investigative team, launched an economic development beat, hired our first ever photojournalist and justice reporter, committed to covering housing as a full-time beat, and are now partnering with Connecticut Public on the hiring of a full-time federal policy reporter, as Bruce pointed out. I'm also thrilled to announce that we will be bringing on another reporter in January, when Jessica Harkey, who formerly of the Fort Worth Star Telegram and the Hartford Courant, will join our newsroom as a statewide education reporter. So a lot of growth, a lot of energy, and we have a nice big newsroom on the 4th floor of the same building as Connecticut Public, where our staff can dirty their own microwave and hang out and have fun together. Now I'd like to introduce my 2 reporters who are on this call with us. Andy Brown, he's a member of our investigative team, and Jaden Edison, who's one of the newest members of our staff, who covers justice for the Mirror. Andy came to us in 2021 from the Post and Courier in South Carolina, where he covered the State House and business. Andy has won multiple investigative and public service awards for his work over the years. And he grew up in Western Pennsylvania and attended the University of Missouri's Graduate School of Journalism. Jaden, who grew up in the Chicago area before moving to Texas, joined our staff in September. Prior to his job here at the Mirror, he held a prestigious summer internship at the Texas Tribune, where he got rave reviews, and interned at the Poynter Institute for Media Studies. He has a bachelor's degree in electronic media from Texas State University, where he was the editor of the school paper, and a master's degree in investigative journalism from the Tony Stabile Center for Investigative Journalism at Columbia University. Welcome, both of you, to this conversation. Jaden, let's start with you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you decided to join the Mirror and come to Connecticut, of all places?
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be here. I saw some familiar names in the participants, so that's pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, it's those broad questions of like who I am. Like it's journalism kind of was an interesting thing for me. Before I ever got involved in student media, I played sports and stuff in high school, and so but I always thought I wanted to be on TV and be like the people on ESPN. Then I had some professors along the way who kind of pushed me toward the paper, and everything just kind of sparked from there. And just in terms of being able to, connect with people, which I think has always been something. I've always been an extrovert from a social standpoint of loving interacting with people, whether it be family or, people in public settings and things of that nature. And so, yeah, I think that was a natural fit for journalism in and of itself. And then, you talk about the Mirror, that was a very, I think, stressful and a drawn out process for me, just in terms of the, the path of finding the first job. I was out of Columbia, I had the Texas Tribune kind of in line, early on, and a couple other things that I had sort of planned on doing. And by virtue of Columbia's program, I got in touch with, obviously the folks here on the call, from the Mirror. And things just kind of started from there. I really appreciated, the human aspect of the recruitment process, just in terms of, they were, very adamant about, bringing me out to Connecticut, which I appreciated. And it wasn't a standard thing that I was, coming across. And, things just felt, I felt like there was a genuine, I guess, desire to bring me on. And I've found early on that that's important. I think you can really detect, I can detect when things aren't genuine and things when they aren't real. And, it's a feel thing, and I didn't necessarily, have that, negative feeling, when it came to the Mirror. And I really appreciated just the onboarding process, that got us here. And then on top of Connecticut, you talk about an environment in which you want to report in. I think, from the outside looking in, I can tell you from experience as somebody who's been in Texas, New York, Chicago, like when people talk about Connecticut, they don't think about it as a diverse state, with people, from all, walks of life. But then when you get to the nucleus of it and you look at the demographics of places like Bridgeport, New Haven, Hartford, I was very intrigued, by that. And I knew that there had to be more, to the story, there, after looking at some of the census data and kind of, looking into it. And so, and seeing the wealth gap, that was also another thing too. So all those factors, I think, kind of played into, me, ultimately being here now and trying to sort of establish, the beat here.
Yeah. And I remember we had a lot of conversations about the wealth disparities in Connecticut when we first met at that Columbia event. And one of the other things that you and I talked about extensively before you decided to come here was your vision for a reimagined justice beat. Our first justice reporter, Kellen Lyons, focused almost exclusively on criminal justice reform and wrote stories that went really deep on issues like bail reform, cash bail reform, and solitary confinement, and more issues like that. And those are really all important topics and that you and our readers are interested in, but your scope is wider. Tell our listeners a little bit about that and how it is manifesting itself in your work so far.
Yeah, it's something, right? I think, when I thought about justice, right, I mean, I've always come from a standpoint of, I think your lived experiences inform the things that, you're interested in and the places you're from. And, one of the first things that I've ever, was privy to was, the summer of 2013, watching the trial of George Zimmerman. I remember people, in prior generations, growing up, we talk about the O.J. Simpson case. It's like that case that kind of was a staple in their, child, in their upbringing. And for me, it was the Trayvon Martin case, and seeing, what seemed like, was a clear fact pattern, right, of like things that happened. And because of this particular law that happened in Florida, the stand your ground law, things didn't necessarily go in Trayvon's, favor, nor his family, right, and George Zimmerman getting acquitted. And so I say all that to say is like, I've always used experiences and things like that as a microcosm of kind of my interests and how I view justice at large, right? Like justice has very much to do, and I think Kellen, someone, I've spoken to him, several times over the course of, my time being here. He's done a great job in establishing a great foundation, within the criminal legal system, right? Which happens to, I think, a big part of that obviously is inside prisons and jails. We see what's happened with, COVID. When we talk about jail facilities, we've seen one of the big cases has been Randy Cox, right, in the New Haven Detention Center here in New Haven. Like we've seen these things that have happened. At the same time, though, justice, in my view, I've always been fascinated with how divided our country is and our cities and states are along the lines of race and income. I think race is at the top of that, but you have the kind of subsets of income and all those things, which kind of make up, the things that we see play out on a day-to-day basis. And so that's kind of been my approach to this justice beat is, I still, am working to make it a point to continue to build on the foundation. I think Kellen has established a great, I guess, again, a great foundation in terms of, what's happening. He set great precedent and great things for me to read back on and kind of pick up on and build and find, spaces, that are obviously still important, especially when you talk about the media landscape elsewhere where there isn't another dedicated justice reporter who's focusing on that. And for me, I look at, disparities in voting, I look at disparities, racial disparities in environment. I'm thinking about, in some ways it intersects with some of the other beats. Disparities in education, right? There's a justice component to that. And so that's kind of been, how I've tried to approach this. Sometimes what people do dictates where you have to be. So in this moment, right, I'm covering a court case, a civil trial in relation to solitary confinement. That's where I need to be at this moment. And so some of the other bigger things are kind of on the back burner, but nonetheless, the foundation is to hopefully, continue to kind of plant seeds in different places and then eventually be able to have the time and the space to come back to them, right, and continue to build on that and establish a well-rounded beat, that covers justice broadly.
Yeah, and one of your earlier, you've not been with the organization long, but one of the first stories you did right out of the gate was the story about early voting, and talk a little bit about how you approached that story.
Yeah, another thing too, I think, whether it was, in student media, at Pointer, even then, and at the Texas Tribune, everywhere I've worked, I've always, and a lot of all my mentors, growing up have always had, and emphasize, this phrase of people over policy, right? Like policy, you get into the jargon of things, it's like people who are in high positions of power tend to understand it, but there isn't a direct connection to the everyday people who policy affects. And so, for me, when it comes to, coming to Connecticut and seeing that, it was one of 4 states, without early voting, was just, to be honest with you, it was baffling to me, just from a standpoint of coming from Texas, which is one of the more restricted places to vote in the country, right, has early voting, 2 weeks of early voting, I can remember from my experience, and seeing that was one of those kind of red flags that, as an outsider perspective, maybe you see and you pick up on. And so, yeah, I wanted to start from a standpoint of, a lot of the news organizations have been reporting, from the standpoint of former Secretary of State, Denise Merrill and other folks, rightfully so, they've done a lot of, work, in terms of getting early voting on the ballot. But I wanted to kind of start on the ground level, right, and talk to people, whom it might affect, who people who didn't even know that it was on the ballot, right? So I went down to Bridgeport, I was looking for different places to go and just meet random people who I hadn't connected with before. And so I went to a local farmers market in Bridgeport, which had been going on throughout the month of October, and just met a bunch of people and connected with them. And I found this like little scene, this anecdote that I could use as a microcosm to address this bigger, thing of early voting. And at the same time, being able to dive into the history of voting restrictions in Connecticut, particularly when it comes against people of color, particularly, Black people, Puerto Ricans. There's a strong history of that in places like Hartford. All that to say is that people over policy has kind of been my motto. And some stories a little bit harder than others, but long term, that's kind of how I would like to approach the work.
Yeah, and we're thrilled to have you in the organization. You're bringing so much context and clarity to some of these issues for all of us, and I'm excited to see the stories that you do in the new year, and especially around maybe environmental justice reporting. I think it's going to be really fascinating for our readers. So thank you, Jaden. And Andy, I'm going to pivot over to you because we have a lot to talk about. So since you joined the Mirror, you've authored some of our most ambitious stories, either by yourself or on a team of other reporters. And they all have one thing in common, which is that you're holding government or people in power accountable for their decisions and their actions. And one of my favorites of the past year, the top 10 hits, was the story you did last January with our former data reporter, Kasturi Pananjadi, that found that the state turning less than 37% of the $2.3 billion it collected through the unclaimed property program. So I know there's an update to that you're going to tell us about in a minute. But as part of that story, and this was the fun part for all of us, we created and published our own searchable database that allowed anyone to go into it and find out if the state was holding any of their property that was valued at less than $50. So what I'd like to do, because I think it's a great story, is have you walk us through why this was happening in the first place and how you and Kasturi reported out this story, because it wasn't easy.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. We approached this story, and I first became aware of it because of a source who had been trying to get the program changed and improved for 3 or 4 years. And the source came to me and explained that the system for unclaimed property in Connecticut, which is essentially, lost bank accounts or checking accounts or insurance policies that people are owed. And the Connecticut Treasurer's Office collects all of those if they, essentially, if a bank or an insurance company can't find that individual for 3 to 5 years. And what my source told me is that, the Connecticut Treasurer's Office has this website that lists all of these pieces of unclaimed property, as they call them, but that some of the smaller assets that the Treasurer's Office collects every year isn't being listed. Anything below $50 essentially wasn't on the website, and so if you were one of the owners of that property, you would have no way of knowing, or would have little way of knowing that that property was in the state's possession and that you could get it back. So I set off from, learning that from the source and trying to verify it with the Treasurer's Office. And what we encountered was that the Treasurer's Office didn't even have a full searchable list that could be exported to us of everyone who owned unclaimed property that was in their possession. What they did have was a CD with, I think it was several 100,000 pages of PDF documents that listed what people were owed and their names. That, of course, isn't searchable. It isn't like an Excel sheet where you can navigate it. So Kasturi, prior to leaving us for the Philadelphia Inquirer, did amazing work in turning that into an actual spreadsheet that people could search their names on. And so we published a story that essentially explained that there was up to or somewhere around $40 million that the state of Connecticut had that was not searchable and not available to people, even if they were owed money. The Treasurer's Office, whenever that story ran, after months of reporting, authored a op-ed in the Hartford Courant in which they claimed that we were misleading people. But less than 2 days later, they ultimately put out a press release announcing that they were revamping the program and changing all of the things that we pointed out in the story. Just in the past 2 weeks here, I've come to learn that they have put out new numbers for the unclaimed property program. And as a result of our story, that now shows that the number of people or the number of owners with property on that has jumped from 1.9 million to more than 9.6 million people or assets. And that the amount of money now on that website for people to go and search has increased from 1.1 million to more than 1.4. I'm sorry, 1.1 billion to 1.4 billion. I guess the point is that there was a lot of money and a lot of people that were owed money that now have at least a chance of claiming that.
Yeah, and did you hear from some of them after the story ran?
We did. We heard from a lot of people who said they not just the people who had their assets that were valued, below $50. I heard from people who had $5,000, $6,000 sitting in the state's possession, but were completely unaware of the fact that the state had possession of this money because the treasurer's office spent next to nothing on advertising the program, but for once a year putting out a press release about it. And so, the amount of money that was claimed last year as well, or the number of people, I should say, that were seeking out their money jumped dramatically from roughly 6,000 people in 2021 to over 24,000 people who were able to obtain their assets in the past fiscal year. So
that's amazing. So, and Connecticut was kind of unusual in the way it was approaching the way it ran this program, right?
Yeah, Connecticut is unique in the fact that it uses the money that's left over each year to fund not only just the general fund, essentially the state budget, but they also put millions of dollars each year into the Citizens Election Fund, which is essentially the public campaign finance system. So essentially lawmakers who are running for office and using public campaign financing to seek those offices are using the finances of this unclaimed property that doesn't get claimed each year.
Yeah. And so the incentive for overhauling this was low until they were kind of publicly shamed into doing it.
I think it was either that or it was a program that has been around for decades that was largely overlooked. And it was just assumed that it was operating as intended. I think the story and what has resulted in the past year clearly shows that there were vast improvements to be made in making sure that program was a public benefit instead of just a fundraising mechanism for state lawmakers.
Right. Great story. And so the other story that I wanted to ask you about was your coverage of the corruption scandal in West Haven. And this started a year ago, last October, right? And we were just starting to look at how cities and towns were going to be spending or had spent the federal CARES Act pandemic funding, the relief funding. And the first story came out that October. Talk a little bit about that story. Walk us through that.
We had been poking around for a while at the several million dollars the millions of dollars that the state of Connecticut was passing out to towns and cities to help carry them through the pandemic and help them cover whatever types of expenses that may result from that pandemic. And so I started poking around on that. And one of the first things that was brought to my attention was there was a lot of complaints about how the city of West Haven was using their money. There were allegations during the political campaigns that appointed officials in the city received compensation or overtime payouts through that CARES Act funding, even though they were salaried employees. So I began asking city officials about that. One of the people that received that overtime payout was Michael DeMassa, who was a state lawmaker and a city employee. I got rebuffed in the beginning whenever I began asking those questions about whether it was legitimate to use the funds for overtime payouts. And they essentially said, there's nothing to see here. everything's fine. I submitted a FOIA on that to try and get to the bottom of it. But before I even got the FOIA response, I got a call from a source down in West Haven that advised me that I should be looking at a company called Compass Investment Group, which was being paid out of the city's finance department. And the tip, which I received an invoice for, quickly, piqued my attention, because if you looked up who owned and operated that company, it was Michael DeMassa.
Right.
That quickly, as we were trying to report that out, quickly spilled into the public. The FBI, we learned about a day later, after I had contacted city council members and the West Haven mayor, the FBI served a subpoena on West Haven City Hall. The mayor came out on YouTube and announced that there was fraud within the CARES Act funding there, though she wouldn't specify what she had found or been told about. And it didn't take long for it to finally burst into view when the FBI arrested Michael DeMassa and charged him with wire fraud last fall. So I continued to poke at that story, however, after the arrest, because I was told that the potential fraud was much larger than one single company that Michael DeMassa controlled. The same sources that I had that pointed me towards Compass Investment Group told me about his new wife, who had been paid out of the city's finance department, and another woman who he had a romantic relationship with, who was also paid for tote bags and other COVID supplies. That ultimately led to, battling with the city of West Haven to get those FOIA requests fulfilled that showed that those two women, received in combination several $100,000, over $100,000. They were one of them, I'm sorry, his wife was ultimately arrested in February as well and charged. So the story took on legs of its own and quickly unfolded into what culminated in a trial earlier last month, right after Thanksgiving, in which Michael DeMassa took the stand as a witness and essentially testified about how he manipulated the city's finance department, defrauded the city, and walked, millions of, or over $1 million out of the city's finance department, and cashed those checks to him and his associates.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that people who don't do this work don't necessarily understand is how much time and effort and just kind of torture goes into trying to verify information that sources give us, or pulling information through what you refer to as FOIA, as Freedom of Information requests, for those on the call who aren't familiar with that term, and trying to get that information from officials, whether they be state officials or local officials. The amount of time that it takes to get from that initial tip, let's say, from a source who sends you a copy of a document, like, talk a little bit about how you were able to verify that information and the process that you had to go through before I and the other editor on the staff, Stephen Busmeyer, were comfortable with this.
Yeah, so it took quite a while to even verify that Michael DeMassa's company, Compass Investment Groups, was being paid out of the city. We had a photo from a source of an invoice.
Right.
In our world, I want to trust that source. I think they're able. If the city is in possession of that record, I want to see it from the city themselves.
Right.
So that took a FOIA, or Freedom of Information Act, request to the West Haven Finance Department and their corporation counsel. And that took a while. So that's the reason whenever the FBI was serving a subpoena on West Haven City Hall, we weren't reporting that DeMassa was paid by the city or his company was paid. We were still in the process of trying to verify that information through a FOIA request. whenever I uncovered the payments that went to Michael DeMoss's now wife, that took a 3.5 to 4 month back and forth with the city of West Haven, in which it took essentially pleading and eventually saying a threat that we would file a complaint with the state FOI commission. These records, there are many ways that state and local officials can hold up a FOIA request, and it was done in these cases. I know that the city of West Haven has a lot going on, but these requests were not voluminous, and it took persistence, it took time and resources. And I will say that I've done this job at daily newspapers. The Mirror gives me a lot of time to focus on essentially wrestling those records out of a local government. It gives me time to focus on that and to make sure that I'm not dropping the ball whenever it comes to pressuring those city or state officials to turn over those records. It's one story. All people see on the website is that we published a story, we got these records. Many of the stories that were related to West Haven that I published were weeks or months in the making, trying to verify what sources in West Haven were whispering about, or were essentially rumoring about. And so that takes resource, takes time, and the willingness to file those FOIA requests.
Absolutely. And it takes time to reach people who don't want to talk. And you have to be very persistent. And we've seen these similar battles play out with state offices over freedom of information requests over the last few years. And that is maybe one of the things that I think the general public just doesn't understand, is that investigative reporting, or even if you want to call it just basic accountability reporting, takes a lot of persistence and a lot of time to ensure that you're not misleading readers about information or being unfair to people. So I know we're getting close to the hour, and I want to give people time for questions, but I also know that Bruce was going to talk briefly before we pivot to questions about our goals for the coming year. So Bruce, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Beth. And thanks, Jaden and Andy. It's always really helpful just to hear your guys' stories. And even for me as the publisher, not involved in the daily journalism, it's always illuminating to hear you talk about how stories come together. In terms of our goals, we've, as you know, been on a hiring spree. The nature of kind of the nonprofit world is that there are grants, you get grants, you then hire people with those grants because you want to advance mission immediately with those grant dollars instead of just saving those grant dollars. And the goal for us now is to sustain all of the number of people that we've hired in the last 3 years. So for 2023, it's really a year of helping our revenue catch up to our headcount, so that when grants do lapse in 24 and 25 or beyond, we are still in a place that we can maintain the current level of staffing and the current level of reporting that we are doing. So we don't have like a lot of big journalism related goals other than things that we've talked about before. The best legislative coverage of anybody in the state in this upcoming long legislative session. Continuing to grow audience will remain critical for us, including more diverse audiences. And the part of that, and a kind of a major goal for us, is to invest in our business team over the next 12 months to be able to provide that financial sustainability that we have talked about. I will say this, our board and our staff are all engaged in a strategic planning process, and we expect that by the end of the first quarter, we will have adopted a new 3-year strategic plan, and there will be some goals that will come out of that plan. So we will check back in with you sometime in the second quarter and give you maybe another meeting similar to this, where we describe what our strategic plan for the next 3 years might be. And there'll be more kind of sharply defined goals that come out of that process. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, and I think I would add that, you know, we recently started a translation effort where we're translating some of our stories into Spanish and putting them on the site. That is something that we would like to continue and deepen our relationships with new audiences around in the coming year. We're engaged in kind of a look at our sourcing diversity, trying to do an audit of who we're sourcing in our stories to ensure that we're not just quoting the same, frankly, white male officials over and over again. When you cover public policy, sometimes that can be a problem. So we're trying to address the diversity issue and the audience issue from a number of different fronts. And I think that's some of the most important work we'll do in the coming year, as well as kind of deepening some of the support for the newsroom in terms of the processes and that we use and that we need to get better at in terms of getting some of these long form projects and stories out onto the site, and so they're not just percolating in our own computers. So one of the questions that we have here is from Barbara. Thank you, Barbara. Looking into government corruption is extremely exhausting. Yes. So I wonder how you decide which issues are worth following up. So good question. So that's hard. It's hard because there's a lot of good stories out there. So what typically is happening for all of our reporters, and particularly our investigative team, is that they're working on a number of stories all at the same time, because they take a long time and they get held up for all kinds of crazy reasons. And so we always want to be able to pivot to something else when one thing is stalled. And sometimes things get ahead of us. They start racing ahead, like somebody's charged in a corruption case or something like that. And so we move quickly. But in terms of like importance of stories, which I think gets more at your question, since we're statewide and we don't typically cover local issues unless they rise to a certain level, like the West Haven case, which involved a state lawmaker and federal pandemic funds, that we tend to look at issues that have a statewide impact. So for us, that's not that difficult because we cover statewide public policy and politics. So how are federal pandemic funds being spent by municipal governments around the state? That's an easy choice. Like we did a story recently on how fire marshals from around the state are assessing the safety of 3-family homes, which tend to be older housing stock in cities, and what happens when they aren't able to conduct those inspections in a timely manner. People can die. And so, you know, I once worked for an editor who led an investigative team at the Hartford Courant who said, you know, we're going to look at issues that affect the health and safety of the residents of this state. And I think that that's largely how we're thinking about it too. We've layered on financial accountability on top of that, I think in a pretty significant way.
Can I just take that real quick?
Sure.
I will say this to anyone who maybe has a tip or something. I always try to hear people out, even if if you have a tip to send us and you have something that you want to tell us, I'm always willing to get on the phone and hear out what you have to try and understand the situation. From there, in my work, what I often try to do is to try to figure out how I would go about verifying that information. So I ask follow-up questions like, okay, does a public agency have records on this? Are there emails? Is there a paper trail? Where does that reside? Who do I need to ask for that? So if you know of something and are looking for us to try and look at that, come prepared. I never overpromise. I never promise that there will be a story. I promise that I will fairly consider it and figure out if there is something verifiable that we can look into there. So do your homework. It is always helpful to come to a reporter. The source in West Haven, who initially tipped me off about the Compass Investment Group, the company that Michael DeMoss set up, had a invoice in hand that she had gotten a photograph of. And that had slipped. I don't know if it slipped to the FBI, but it certainly came to me. And that's the type of evidence, I knew that was an actionable story as soon as I looked up who owned the company. So that's what I look for whenever, and it could be any subject. We have people in this newsroom who are doing a lot of different subjects at this point. We're no longer just a state house focused team. So I always tell people that reporters don't know what they don't know. And so always feel free to reach out to us. And I know a lot of people who are worried with stories, they reach out to me in the, they don't want to be on the record. And I always tell people that I am willing to have those background conversations to learn what they know. All I expect is that they be truthful with me about who they are, and what their motives are. So.
Great tips, Andy. I don't see any other questions, I don't think. And we've hit the hour.
We've got a question in the chat, Beth.
That's right. I sometimes hear people complain that a news source that I trust is biased toward the liberal viewpoint. I think that they usually mean that the source covers topics that liberals like, but conservatives don't. Do you get this sort of complaint, and what do you think about it? Bruce, you're the one who hears that sort of thing most often, so I'm going to let you take that question.
We do get that complaint, but interestingly enough, we also get the reverse complaint occasionally as well. And it's kind of cliche to say, in fact, we had a training where we were told this was cliche, this notion of, well, if you're getting complaints from both sides, then you must be doing something right. We don't necessarily react that way. We react in terms of, reflecting on those complaints or those observations, let's call it that. And we're not perfect. We all of our journalists have and Jaden talked about this, have their own lived experience and their own perspective, and their job is not to be, to somehow be able to check their perspective at the door when they do their reporting, but to be aware of it and to try to be as fair and accurate as possible and share with their public what it is they've learned through their reporting process. And so that's an ongoing, it seems to me as an outsider looking into the newsroom, but the three of you could probably address this better than I, but I do know that, you all and we as an organization reflect on that and acknowledge that we're not always perfect. And sometimes language or perspectives or perceptions do make it into some of our stories, but we try to learn from that when it happens.
Jaden and Andy, do you have anything to add to that? I think that accurately sums it up.
Yeah, I would just add that I think, I've always found this notion in various places that I've been. I think when with certain people, when it comes to community engagement, right? Like this notion, I think people typically tend to understand journalism as this kind of almost like a black and white kind of approach to it, right? It's like, hey, just give us the news, give us both sides, and let us decide how we want to feel. And I think, historically speaking, this notion of journalistic objectivity, has been, over the years kind of, it's transformed from what its initial intent was. And so I've always viewed it, historically, when you have, people like, the name's slipping off the top of my head now, but they'll come to me as I'm talking. But nonetheless, objectivity was meant to be, a method that helped you arrive at the truth, right? Like sort of like scientists do. Like there's a scientific method that helps you, arrive at a certain conclusion. And that was what the intent for journalism was supposed to be when it came to certain, thinkers, in the industry. And over time, I think it's been sort of, manipulated, and it's transformed into this notion that, reporters are people who don't have opinions. They come in without perspectives and you just give us the news. And I think, that approach can be particularly dangerous, especially when we talk about the environment in which we're in now, where we've seen, a bevy of threats, to democracy, right? Like I don't think that you can approach, coverage of a January 6th with the lens of, hey, there are both sides and let's just give people the facts. I don't think you can, it comes down to, when I walk out, the sky's blue. That's not up for debate, right? Like murder's wrong. Like that's not something that we're gonna, sit here and debate. And so I think, from a journalism perspective, that's how I, approach my work is to always, I think there's debate on, how we present those things. I know one big thing I've always thought about it with people, some of the most prominent journalism in the industry is people like, Wes Lowry and Nicole Hannah-Jones and Jelani Cobb, people who are, prominent in the field. But they've always approached with a form of what we call moral clarity, right? It's like you have, you have your lived experiences and things like that. But one, you approach the work with a level of fairness, and there's also a process. And then when you have a set of facts that the work that you put in the work to sort of arrive at, you use those facts guide you toward the language and the descriptions and the things and how you report, what the news is. And first and foremost, our job is to write the truth, above all else. And that, the truth isn't always a popular thing, right? So I just, I don't know if that helps answer that question, but I do think maybe that helps bring some perspective into how, various journalists kind of approach the work. And so I've always thought about it, from that lens, right? And then also I think there's always power dynamics, and those are things that you have to factor in as well, right? Like people, who are low income, who tend to be predominantly Black and brown people, don't have access to the same educational resources, various resources that everyday people, who, work on Wall Street or, who work at the Capitol in Connecticut, if we want to, hyper localize it, you don't have that kind of access. And so I think, there's a particular job on journalists to be able to bridge that gap and provide clarity, to the issues at hand.
Yeah. Thank you, Jaden. I think that was well said. And I think this part of the conversation speaks to how difficult journalism can be right now, and how we're all kind of sitting in these questions all the time as we try to sort through what's happening in the world around us. And that can be deeply uncomfortable for journalists and for the people who read our work. But we are grateful for you as our audience and our readers. And so I think we're past the hour. So I think we're going to wrap. And I thank you all very, very much for coming and listening to what we had to say. We appreciate you all.